Welcome back to Hexes, Haunts, and Howls. I'm your host, Cupcake. Today is episode 5 of Stars, Stripes, and Secrets, a series where we dive into leaked government documents and classified mysteries. The room is quiet in that sterile, unnatural way only hospitals can manage. Fluorescent lights hum softly overhead. The walls are too white, too clean. The kind of clean that feels like it's hiding something. Machines beep in slow, steady rhythms beside the bed, proof of life reduced to numbers and beeps. A patient lies there, half awake, weak, trusting. They've been told they're receiving treatment. Maybe it's for pain. Maybe it's something experimental, but safe. That word gets used a lot. Safe. A doctor steps in, calm and composed, clipboard in hand. No sense of urgency, no warning, simple routine. A nurse follows, carrying a syringe. Clear liquid. No label the patient can read. No explanation offered. There's a pause, just long enough for doubt to flicker. Wait, what is that? But the question doesn't really land. It floats in the air, unanswered, dismissed with a reassuring smile, a hand on the shoulder, a quiet, practiced voice. It's going to help you. And that's enough, because it has to be. The needle slides in, a small pinch, barely anything at all. And just like that, it's over. No alarms, no dramatic shift. Just the same quiet room, the same humming lights, the same steady beating. But something has changed. Something the patient won't understand for days, maybe weeks, maybe ever. Because this wasn't treatment. It wasn't care. It wasn't even medication. It was data. A test. A decision made somewhere far from this room by people who will never meet the person in this bed. People who already decided the risk was acceptable. The patient exhales slowly, eyes drifting shut again, trusting that they're being helped. Trusting that someone is looking out for them. They're not. And they won't know that until it's far too late. They didn't know they were part of an experiment, and by the time they found out, it was too late. The world changed a lot in an instant. In those final days of World War II, the United States unleashed something the world had never seen before. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, atomic bombs were dropped on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The explosions themselves were catastrophic, flattening cities, igniting firestorms, killing tens of thousands in seconds. But the true horror didn't end with that blast. It lingered. People who lived the initial explosion began to fall sick days later. Hair fell out, skin blistered. Internal organs failed without visible cause. Entire bodies seemed to unravel. No one fully understood why. Not yet. Radiation. Once an abstract scientific concept, had become a silent, invisible weapon. One that didn't just kill instantly, but slowly, unpredictably, and without mercy. And that terrified the people in power. Because if they didn't understand it, they couldn't control it. In the months and years that followed, the United States government shifted into overdrive. The race wasn't just about building bigger weapons anymore. It was about understanding what those weapons did to the human body. How much radiation could a person survive? What did it do over time? Could exposure be treated or weaponized further? These weren't just scientific questions. They were military ones, strategic ones, and the pressure to find answers was immediate. Then came the early days of the Cold War. A new kind of war began, one built on fear, secrecy, and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. The United States and the Soviet Union weren't just competing in weapons, they were competing in knowledge. Information became currency. Secrecy became policy. And anything that could provide an advantage, anything at all, was justified, even if it crossed lines that should have never been touched. Behind closed doors, classified programs began to take shape. Scientists, military officials, and government agencies worked together under a single priority: understand radiation, no matter the cost. And slowly, quietly, that cost began to include the very people they were meant to protect. It didn't look unusual. A hospital room, a patient in a bed, a doctor with a syringe. Routine. That's what made it so easy. In the mid-1940s, a small number of hospitalized patients, men and women, already vulnerable, already trusting, were injected with a substance they were never told about: plutonium. A radioactive element so dangerous it was studied for use in nuclear weapons. And now, quietly, inside the human body. The goal was not to treat them. It was to track how plutonium moved through the bloodstream, where it settled, how long it stayed. The patients weren't asked. There was no informed consent, no real explanation, no understanding of risk. To them, it was just another injection. To the people behind it, it was data collection. And once it was in their bodies, it couldn't be taken back. For others, the exposure wasn't hidden inside a syringe. It was direct. Patients were placed in front of radiation sources and exposed to levels far beyond what the body could safely handle. Some of them were already ill, but not all were terminal. And even for those who were sick, this wasn't care. It was observation. Doctors and researchers watched as the human body broke down over extreme radiation. Nausea that wouldn't stop. Burns forming beneath the skin. Organs failing, one by one. Weakness turned into collapse. Collapse turned into silence. And through it all, notes were taken. Measurements recorded. Results analyzed. Because the suffering wasn't the outcome. It was the point. Then there were the ones who had even less choice. Pregnant women, children. In some studies, radioactive substances were given to expectant mothers, not to help them, but to understand how radiation moved through the body and into the developing fetus. How much would cross the placenta? What damage would it cause? No one could fully answer those questions at the time, but they tested anyway. Children, too, were exposed in different ways, sometimes through food, sometimes through medical procedures presented as harmless. Growing bodies, developing organs, all quickly turned into case studies. The long-term effects? Many were never fully tracked. Some weren't even acknowledged, because by the time the questions started being asked, the damage had already been done. And for many of them, there was no way to undo it. They didn't choose people who could fight back. They chose people who wouldn't be believed or wouldn't be heard at all. Hospital patients with no money, no power, no reason to question a doctor in a white coat. People who depended on the system completely because they had nowhere else to go. Many of them were poor, admitted to public hospitals, treated in crowded wards where care was stretched thin and questions were few. When a doctor walked in, you didn't challenge them. You listened. Because they were the authority. Because they were supposed to help. And because for a lot of those patients, that hospital bed was the only place they had. Others were already sick. Some were told they were terminal. Some weren't. But that distinction didn't seem to matter. A diagnosis, real or assumed, became justification. If someone was already dying, what was the harm in studying them? The question hung unspoken in the background of these decisions. Cold, clinical, convenient. And then there are the children. Too young to understand. Too young to consent. They trusted the adults around them. Parents, nurses, doctors. They didn't know that what they were being given, what was being done to them, was never meant to help, only to observe. No one explained the risks. No one sat them down and said, "This is an experiment." There were no signed agreements, no real choice, just quiet compliance. Because when you're lying in a hospital bed, you assume the people standing over you are there to save you, not use you. That's what makes this different. It wasn't just unethical. It was betrayal. Trust, taken and twisted into something else entirely. And for years, decades even, it stayed buried. No headlines, no warnings, no justice, just silence. From the people who knew exactly what they had done. It wasn't done in the open. It couldn't be. Because even at the time, they knew how it would look. The justification was simple. National security. In the shadow of the Cold War, fear became policy. The threat of nuclear war wasn't theoretical. It felt inevitable. If another bomb dropped, if soldiers were exposed, if entire cities were irradiated, someone needed answers. How much radiation could the human body take? What would it do over time? Could it be survived? And if those answers weren't found first, someone else would find them. That was the mindset. That was the pressure. So the programs were buried, classified, compartmentalized, hidden behind layers of clearance and silence. Documents stamped secret, names removed, details scattered across agency so no single person saw the full picture. To the public, none of it existed. To the patients, it was never explained. And in the middle of it all were the doctors, the scientists, the people who had sworn at some point to do no harm. Some believed they were serving a greater good, that the knowledge gained might one day save lives, even if it cost a few along the way. Others knew exactly what it was, and they did it anyway, because orders came from above, because careers were on the line, because questioning the system, especially then, came with consequences. Ethics didn't disappear. They were overridden, buried under urgency, under fear, under the idea that this had to be done. That in a world on the brink of nuclear war, there were lines you simply couldn't afford to respect. So it stayed hidden, locked away in files no one outside the system would see. A quiet agreement between those involved. Don't ask, don't tell, don't leave a trail that leads back here. And for a long time, that silence held. For decades, it stayed buried, tucked away in archives, hidden behind classifications, protected by time, silence, and the assumption that no one would ever go looking. But eventually, someone did. By the 1990s, questions that had lingered in whispers started to surface in public. Journalists began digging. Families began asking. Old records, long forgotten, started to resurface in places they weren't supposed to be. And the story that began to take shape was impossible to ignore. In 1994, the U.S. government established the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments. Its purpose was simple: find the truth, no matter how buried it was. What they uncovered confirmed what many had feared, and what others had tried to deny. The experiments did happen. Not rumors, not exaggerations, not conspiracy. Documented, verified, real. They found evidence of patients being injected with radioactive substances without their knowledge. Records showing that consent, true, informed consent, was often never given. In some cases, patients weren't told anything at all. In others, they were misled, given partial truths dressed up as care. And it wasn't isolated. It wasn't one hospital, or one doctor, or one mistake. It was widespread, across institutions, across years, across entire programs designed to stay hidden. The conclusions were clear and devastating. Ethical violations weren't the exception. They were part of the system, built into it. For the victims and their families, the truth came decades too late. There were no redos, no way to undo what had been done. Only answers. Cold, clinical answers, pulled from files that had been sitting in the dark for years. The silence had finally broken. But what it revealed was far worse than what anyone had imagined. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments. A name in a report. A date that didn't make sense. A medical record that raised more questions than it answered. And for many families, it came decades too late. Sons, daughters, grandchildren, people who had trusted that their loved ones were treated with care, only to learn they had been used instead. Some discovered a parent had been part of an experiment they never consented to. Others realized a diagnosis or a sudden decline might have not been natural at all. Imagine finding that out years later, after the funerals, after the grief had already settled into something permanent, only to have it ripped open again with a different kind of pain. When the findings became public, outrage followed. Not the quiet discomfort, not mild concern. Outrage. Because this wasn't just history. It was betrayal. By institutions people were supposed to trust the most. Hospitals, doctors, the government itself. In 1995, under President Bill Clinton, the U.S. government formally acknowledged what had happened. An apology was issued to the victims and their families. Not vague, not deflecting, direct. An admission that people had been wronged, that trust had been broken, that lines, ethical, human, had been crossed in the name of progress. But an apology does not undo the past. It doesn't erase what was done or give back what was taken. And for many, it didn't feel like enough. Even now, the impact lingers. These events reshaped how medical research is conducted, leading to stricter rules around informed consent, patient rights, and oversight. But they also left behind something harder to fix. Doubt, skepticism, a quiet question that still exists in the background of modern medicine. How far is too far when the stakes are high enough? Because this story didn't just end in the 1990s. It echoes. In every consent form signed, in every clinical trial approved, in every patient who places their trust in someone wearing a white coat. A reminder that progress, without boundaries, can become something else entirely. This wasn't a conspiracy theory. It wasn't rumor. It wasn't exaggeration. It was documented. Signed, filed, and approved. Real people placed into real situations without their knowledge, without their consent, and without a way out. That's what makes it different. The horror isn't in something unknown, it's in something proven. Because the question it leaves behind isn't just about the past, it's about human nature, about power, about what happens when people convince themselves that the end justifies the means. How far will people go when they believe it's for the greater good? The doctors believed they were advancing science. The officials believed they were protecting a nation. The system believed it was necessary. And maybe, in their minds, it was. But that belief came at a cost. One paid by people who never agreed to it. People who trusted the system completely, never realizing the system had already decided their role in it. And that's where the story lingers. Not in the past, but in the present. In every institution we rely on. In every authority we trust without question. In every moment we assume that someone, somewhere, is acting in our best interest. Because most of the time they are. But as history has already shown, that isn't always true. And the real horror, it doesn't come from monsters in the dark. It comes from ordinary people making decisions behind closed doors and believing they're justified. And maybe that's the part that stays with you. Not just what happened, but the possibility that stories like this don't always stay in the past. Because hospitals, doctors, experiments, they still exist. Every day, all around us. And most of the time, they save lives. But sometimes, people walk away with questions they can't answer. Experiences they can't explain. Moments that never quite made sense. So let me ask you, have you ever had a medical experience that felt off? Something you were told not to worry about, but it stayed with you anyway? A procedure that didn't feel fully explained? A family story that never quite added up? If you have a story like that, I want to hear it. Strange medical experiences, unexplained treatments, things that didn't sit right then and don't sit right now. You can submit your stories to hexes, haunts, and howls at gmail.com. Again, that's hexes, haunts, and howls, all one word, at gmail.com. All stories will remain anonymous. Thank you for listening to Hexes, Haunts, and Howls. I'm your host, Cupcake. Until next time, stay sweet.